Hello and welcome to Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist and specialist in the ancient world.
And I'm Tom Pedrick, historian of modern Europe.
We're back with our modern artifacts of sorts, and what we've been trying to show is that antiques and collectibles are actually fascinating things, and I think most people know that, but they don't look at them as closely as perhaps they could. I think they're compelling pieces of connection to the past that we really want to look into. It's a reason to do research.
Yeah, that's definitely true. When we look at these objects, you have to realize somebody made it, somebody used it, and possibly even cherished it. It had meaning then, and it has meaning now.
Exactly. So there's all these different answers to so many questions that are embedded in every object, and we dig to find that.
And what better questions to ask than those of the artifactualist?
I think a lot of collectors and antique dealers, etc., ask many of these questions, but I think we're really trying to do it more in depth and really only with that purpose in mind, not to try to figure out what its value is now monetarily, but rather its historical value, what it can tell us about the past. And today's objects, we're going to look into a period it's a long time ago, but not to the antique stage. In order to be an antique, it has to be 100 years or older. And these aren't quite that, but they are from the period of the Second World War. And most people talk about the battles and the fighting, but we're going to look at a less often discussed aspect, the home front in the United States.
You're right. The home front isn't the first thing I think of when I think of the Second World War. I usually think of D-Day or Stalingrad or Okinawa. But as horrible as those engagements were, people on the home front made a lot of sacrifices as well for the war effort, and that's worth remembering.
It is true that when you decide as a nation to go to war with another one, well, everybody has to pitch in if you're going to win that. The people who can actually go to a battle do, and the people who can't stay at home and they supply the war effort. We call it a command economy. Everything in the economy tends to be directed towards one goal, winning the war. FDR himself said, "To win, we must fight, and to fight, we must produce." It's absolutely true. You can't fight a war if you don't have the supply lines, if you can't feed your troops and keep them moving. So that's going to lead us into our first artifact. Is a lapel pin. So we're looking here, of course, at a direct close-up, and it looks pretty big. It's actually not very big at all. We will look at it with our close-up camera so that I can show it a little bit better here. And you can see that it is quite small. Here it is in my fingers. And it has a large letter E in the center, and that stands for excellence. So, to keep people moving towards this goal, you often need a kind of pat on the back. The people who are fighting will often get medals, and because of their bravery or whatnot. Well, what about the people at home? The government recognized this and thought, well, we want to reward the people who are working hard to help us win this war. So they created this award for the workers. What it really is a combination of other awards that had already existed. Before World War I, there was a Navy E award and there was an Army A award, and then those combined with the Army-Navy Munitions Board star to make this pin. Where? Well, in the United States, right? So the USA entered the war
December 7th, 1941, but also right afterwards, Hitler's fateful decision to declare war on the United States.
Dates like that are important, but we've always said that it's not the only thing. You can't learn these things just by dates,
Right, right.
But we do talk about the when question on this object, and of course it's connected with America entering as a belligerent. We had been sending things to Britain before we entered the war, but we weren't technically fighting it. So we entered after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This lapel pin, this award, comes out not too long after that. So July of 1942 approximately is when this first is created and awarded. And all of the companies in the U.S. pretty much were, as I say, in a command economy, working towards winning the war. So it's obvious with things like steel for building things, and rubber that we would need. This is one of the things I hadn't thought much about, but a lot of rubber comes from Southeast Asia, places like Indonesia. This was controlled by Japan, so we couldn't get it, and we had to do a lot of recycling and things like that. And companies that were making things out of rubber, things that were using oil or steel or metals of all sorts. But not just that, even companies that made lighting and paper clips and anything else, they're all trying to do this. About 85,000 companies across the U.S. were involved in this, and only about 5% of them ever won this award. So, you know, it's an important thing, I think, and it's a way of saying thanks for all the work you guys are doing. Well, it wasn't just companies that got this necessarily, at least in one case. There was one person who got it individually, and that was Dr. Harley A. Wilhelm. He invented a way of purifying uranium, and they gave him this award for that. Well, it continued, of course, through the war into 1945, and when they first issued this in 1942, they awarded it in this huge ceremony. So everybody from the company got to go to a nice hotel for, a restaurant there. They would have drinks and dancing and a great meal, and this would be great. Of course, it's a good way to say thank you. However, by 1943, they realized this is kind of expensive, so they scaled back, and they would just mail the pins to the workers, and some military official would show up at the plant and give the award to the company, which was a pennant that you would fly at the actual factory. And the companies could receive it multiple times, and a very few, got it up to 6 times during the war. But there are other aspects of the internal economy. So people who are working in these factories, they also have to live. They've got to get their food. And I think that is going to lead us into our second artifact.
That leads us there very nicely. Our second artifact is an Office of Price Administration red point token. They came in red point and blue points. Referring to the Office of Price Administration, these tokens were frequently referred to as either OPAs or OPAs, but I'm not exactly sure how they pronounced it.
And it makes me think of the OPA, which is, well, a Greek expression.
Well, yeah, you've excavated in Greece. Do people actually say that?
Well, I have to say that I haven't really heard it. I spent most of my time on Crete. I did about 8 seasons work there, and I didn't see them saying that. But I've been to Greek restaurants in the U.S. where maybe it's an old tradition or a mainland thing. But in this case, of course, it's an abbreviation, not a Greek word.
Right, and we do know there were 30 different red and 24 different blue tokens based on the letter combination.
Yeah, I'm going to show this thing under the camera too, and it is quite small, and I'm going to try to get it even closer. So this one's got the letters on the sides of the one. It's a UH, and we can see that on both sides it's the same. It's no difference between the front and the back. And it's also, I've got a 1942 dime here to show so that we know the different sizes. This thing's just about the same, not quite.
Just a little smaller.
Right, and I guess as comparison, we can see that the pin is also pretty small.
Oh, yeah, that is.
Finally, we have a blue point as well. And this one, XX are the 2 letters.
We know that certain letter varieties, certain letter combinations are quite rare, and therefore sought after by collectors, but we're not exactly sure what these letters mean.
I'm even trying to rack my brains to think, well, first of all, I think usually administrations are very thorough, and shouldn't they have written this down, and yet nobody seems to have the evidence. And secondly, I think of coins with mint marks. They tell us where they were manufactured. Do you think that could be the reason?
Yeah, maybe it was a particular factory that was making them.
But there's so many. You said 30 types on the red, right? And 24 on the blue.
Right.
There wouldn't be that many factories making them, I don't think. Who knows? It's one of these questions we can't answer. We don't always answer our questions, do we? So
that's true. So usually, and this happens in history, you come up with more questions than answers.
Mm-hmm. But there were quite a few of these made, I think.
Yeah, there were roughly 900 million of the blue and at least 1 billion of the red made. After the war, many were destroyed. Others were just thrown into cabinets in somebody's house and forgotten about. Mm-hmm. And then collectors find them and said, hey, what is this? And when they ask that question, they could learn about rationing on the home front.
Well, yeah, which is very important. This is part of the controls of the domestic economy, right?
Exactly. The whole idea was that people have to get stuff at home, and troops abroad have to get stuff. We want to make it at least somewhat fair, so we have to control it. Now, rationing began in 1942, right after the American entry into the war. It began actually with stamps, which in Ration Book 2 were both red and blue. So red and blue from the beginning was an essential part of this process.
Right. We have a picture of a later. This is a ration book number 3, and the one you were just talking about is ration book 2, right? That had the blue and the red.
Right.
This one, they changed things up a little bit, and the stamps inside them, they don't really have much color. Instead, they've got a picture of, well, military hardware here, a howitzer or
Howitzer?
something there. That's what
Yeah.
it looks like. And that, I mean, obviously shows that it's wartime. But the second book had the actual blue, and it had the number of points that it was worth. So you got 48 points in a cycle, and I don't know if a cycle was a week or what, and they were in different values. So you had a stamp that was an 8, a 5, a 2, and a 1, and you would have to give
Right.
the ones that were appropriate, I guess, for whatever you were buying. But this one, the one I just showed,
Each one at this point was worth 10.
right,
And then to make exact change, the government began issuing these 1-point tokens in 1944. So our artifact here is relatively late in the war.
yes, so starting in 1944 they used that, because I don't know exactly when the third book came out. I think these started issuing when the fourth book came out.
Right, right. And just a quick note that rationing didn't end immediately after the cessation of hostilities in 45. Actually went on until November 1946. It was phased out, and on November 9th, 1946, President Truman officially gave an executive order ending rationing.
Right, and in Britain they continued well into the 1950s because they were even harder hit by the war, of course.
That makes sense. It takes a while to really swing back from such a traumatic experience.
And as I understand it, there were certain point values for certain goods, right? And you had to give stamps. They weren't money, because you had to give money as well, but you had to give a
Right,
certain number
right.
of stamps for each good, right? And the blue and the red meant different things?
Yes, red was for meat, whereas blue was for more processed and canned foods.
And it makes sense, I guess, because those canned foods can be shipped to the troops, whereas
Right.
fresh goods,
They were not rationed.
right, because, and everyone was encouraged to grow a victory garden, right? Grow your own
Right,
vegetables,
right,
so,
right.
yeah.
Produce and help the war effort. Also, buy locally. It's just like today.
Oh, and recycling too. Everybody was recycling everything, you know?
Right,
And,
scrapping metals.
yep, and rubber tires and all this stuff, they would try to make new things out of them.
Yeah, because as you said, it's hard to get to those forests in Sumatra.
And so you have to reuse everything you possibly can.
Right,
And that,
and also we want to avoid things like families hoarding coffee or sugar.
I wouldn't advocate rationing now, but I'm saying we can learn a lot from that. You know, we should reuse
Oh,
everything we can instead of just
right,
buying
right.
all the time and generating trash and things like that. So,
Yeah, it's kind of funny you said that because about a year ago we had the toilet paper and paper towel scare.
can you imagine if we had tried to ration that? I don't know if it would have worked, but maybe we should have, because it disappeared from the shelves, right?
People would have been really indignant. It is funny that the Office of Price Administration actually received a nickname during the war, the Office of Overpriced Administrators.
I think we can
People
identify with
always,
that even now.
yes, people always have a sarcastic reaction to government, for lack of a better word, interference.
Yeah, and yet you can see why they had to do this. I mean, the
Absolutely,
OPA,
absolutely.
they fixed prices so that things wouldn't change. They said stamps are used for these and the same ratios, and they were trying to make sure everybody got the same amount instead of somebody with money being able to buy up all the shelves of one good and no one else getting it, right? So,
True, true. And the OPA used ration boards across the country, and nationally there were more than 8,000 boards. I'm sure some were efficient. I'm sure some were bureaucratic and inept. And how do I know this? Because they were run by humans.
yeah, right.
You'll get everything.
And of course, the U.S. is a huge country, so you need local administrations or different boards around the country. And well, with all of this control, I'm sure that people kind of felt secondary, but you're also supporting a really big effort, you know, and we all are pitching in. So I think that can sustain you for a while. the goal is more important than the individual, but you still need to show that appreciation. So that's why I think things like these pins are important. And at the time, what the humble factory worker, whoever says thank you to them.
Right.
Well, the pins were awarded for excellence in production, but it's not just that. It's also cooperating between management and workers, and it's safety. All of these categories that I was talking about before, it's not just make the most stuff. It's make the most stuff in the safest manner, taking care of the people who are working. And I think that's good. You need to have these
Right.
other regulations too, and the award shouldn't just be thrown at someone because they're working everyone to death. Now, that would be bad. So they wanted low absenteeism, low waste, they want high cooperation. They're all great goals. Well, talk a little bit more about how this thing was made. As I'd said, at first it was fairly fancy, and I'm going to show a picture of the back, and you can see it tells us Army-Navy Production Award, and it says that it's made of sterling silver. And then it has these enamel red and white and blue stripes. See, there's a wreath around the E, a bow at the bottom, and then there's different leaves to the left side and the right side. And this is pretty typical of this kind of wreath. It's usually oak leaf on the left and laurel wreath on the right. It's such a detail that I guess most people wouldn't really look into, but I'm a nerd.
That's
so.
excellent.
Well, the oak tends to suggest strength and the laurel, victory. This is a wartime thing. We're trying to win the war, so we want victory. Only 5% of companies won the award, but 85,000 companies, 5%, you're looking at over 4,000 companies, and each surely had 100 or more workers, maybe 200, maybe more than that. So when you think about it, maybe around 1 million of these pins were issued. And I have seen some that are base metal, so it looks like towards the end of the war, they started saying, well, sterling silver, too expensive, we're going to make them out of this. It's just, an award. It doesn't have to be silver, just like we don't have to have a big celebration at a hotel. And I can see that. It does seem a little bit, if you win one of these late in the war and it's not as special, maybe. But anyway, we all know that, the war's dragging on and we need to win. So who got it? Workers at the companies. And it was everybody who was working there. Everybody got one of these pins. The company got the pennant to fly. But one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that the majority of the people working in the factories were women. And so I think that many of these, maybe even the majority of these pins were given to women. And we don't think about that much. I guess we do hear, yes, of course, women took the jobs because the men were off fighting. But
Right.
I think it's important to recognize, well, the award went to them in most cases because they were doing the jobs. They were doing the real work to supply the people fighting.
Sure, and it was a milestone in gender history, too.
It seems rather odd, though, that as the men came back from fighting when we won the war, it kind of went backwards, Women had proven,
Right.
of course, we
Right.
can do all of these jobs, and yet they were told to go back to the homes. Well, everyone did pitch in, of course. Children also, like Boy Scouts particularly, would run these sort of collection efforts, maybe drag a wagon around and say, if you got any scrap metals, or they would collect things for the recycling bins, And so everybody pitched in. And rationing, of course, was part of this.
Absolutely. It was an integral part. It protected supplies at home and abroad because trade was terribly disrupted by the war. You had German U-boats in the Atlantic, and like you said, the Japanese Empire spread throughout Asia, so a lot of these resources couldn't be sought. So taking us back to our OPA token, how was it used? Well, the ration stamps were issued to every American, even to children. So retailers were using these coins, just like that blue one, as exact change for the consumer. Blue, as we said, were for the process, red for meat, for fats, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Ration goods could not be bought without first presenting the required stamp, which, while I was researching this, it just led me to the question, what went on in terms of counterfeiting? What went on in the black market, organized crime? How did they get around it? I'm sure they did.
Well, it's one of the things that fascinates me because I study the history of money, which naturally leads into the history of corruption, really, because often any monetary system, people try to find a way to cheat it. And although the stamps weren't monetary, they still allowed you to buy certain goods. So I have heard that they did counterfeit these stamps. I don't know how often, but it happened.
And were the counterfeits any good?
Well, I guess you could fool them because they don't look that difficult to counterfeit to me. But,
Right.
if we look at the stamp itself, it's pretty small and it's paper. There is a kind of background. You can see a great seal, the eagle and the shield, and it says, I think, USG for U.S. government and ration. And that's in a faded ink behind the black howitzer, etc. So, yeah, it might take a little bit to make sure you've got that safety paper.
Right. Right.
But we did an episode where we saw they were counterfeiting the sweepstakes tickets. And,
Yeah.
if you can,
Yeah.
you could say, oh, you want to get those high point goods? Well, I'll make these for you and you just have to give me money. I'm sure they did it.
Well, that leads us to our next question. How were these made? And were these tokens themselves counterfeited?
I doubt that. They were low point value, but maybe.
Right.
But yeah, like you were saying, the manufacturing of them is interesting.
Well, they're made of what's called vulcanized fiber.
It makes me think of live long and prosper kind of thing,
Actually, that's one of the first things that ran through my mind.
The Vulcan, that it's related to volcano and all of this stuff as well. So
Right,
Vulcan
right.
was a Roman god, Hephaestus in Greek, who manufactured things. So it's kind of interesting. But it also connects with rubber, right?
Right. We have a fibrous interior with either a red or blue coating.
If I go to the close-up camera to show that you can see the red coating on this, and then I don't know, more cardboard-like interior.
Yeah, from the side, it almost looks like it's cork.
But it doesn't quite feel, it feels stiffer than cork to me. It does look very much like cork, though, you're right.
And then, of course, we have our question, who? Who would have used this? It's one of our integral questions. Every American, like we said, was issued ration books. The exact way rationing function varied by state and by board.
Mm-hmm.
There's 8,000 boards. But again, everyone was being given this.
Yeah, at first I thought it was maybe each family got a book, but I've read that no, it was
That's what I thought, too,
every
yeah.
person. Because even on the instructions on that one booklet, it says if this is issued to someone under the age of 18, then an adult has to sign for them, but they still got the ration book.
Right, right. And I guess that makes sense because if you had one ration book per family, they would go through the points too quickly.
Yeah, I guess you could issue more points, but then you would need different books for different size families, and it just
Right.
wouldn't work. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, it just goes to show everybody had to pitch in and play a role in the war, either on the battlefield or at home.
Yeah, that is the main theme that we've definitely been seeing. People grew victory gardens, children collected things to recycle, everybody used ration stamps. And I guess I hadn't really thought much about it. I knew that there were sacrifices made on the home front. My grandparents' generation lived through the Great Depression and the war, and yet I guess looking at these objects actually made me think much more about that time period and the kinds of sacrifices people had to make at home.
Yeah, it makes it all a little bit more real.
Exactly, and that's our main point. Artifacts can anchor us to history. But I think that's about all the time we have for this time. Join us again next time. I'm Brad Hafford.
And I'm Tom Pedrick.
Until the next episode of Artifactually Speaking.
See you soon.